In my most recent video, we did a deep dive into the everlasting or eternal moral law, also known as the Ten Commandments. But I think there's a misconception about the Ten Commandments. And that's what I want to share this very short video about, is hopefully a new way of looking at the Ten Commandments. Because there's a lot of influence from the devil saying, oh, the Ten Commandments are oppressive or they're no longer valid. But let's look into that and see, is that even true? So I think the first way to look at it would be changing your perspective. And what if we looked at the first 5 commandments, how they would be if you wanted to be treated as a parent? So imagine you're a parent. How do you want to be treated? Well, if we look at the first, have no other gods before me. Would you want your child calling someone else mom or dad instead of you? Right? The one that loves and cares for them? How would that make you feel? Right? What about don't make any idols? How would you feel if your child was thanking the refrigerator for giving them food instead of you, who worked hard to provide it for them? Or don't take the Lord's name in vain. A lot of times we think that this as, don't say his name in vain. But if we say that we are a Christian and then don't act like one, isn't that the same thing? How would you feel if your child who carries your last name acted in a way that was completely disrespected your values or tarnished your family's reputation? What about remember the seventh day? How would you feel if your child never wanted to spend time with you? What about number 5? Honor thy father and thy mother. How would you feel if your child consistently disrespected or ignored your role in their life? So I think if we look at these, we would say, okay, those are all fairly reasonable, especially through the lens of a parent. But let's look at the last 6 here, the last 5. How would you want to be treated as a host? Imagine you've invited someone over to your house, and you just say, they're like, hey, what are the rules for being over here? You're like, oh, it's really straightforward. Here, the first one just is don't kill, right? Is it reasonable to ask that no one harms you or takes your life or someone's in the life of your home? And is it reasonable to ask others not to steal your spouse or, anyone in trust and relationships? Is it reasonable to ask others not to take things that don't belong to them? Is it reasonable to ask others not to spread lies and damaging someone's reputation? And is it reasonable to ask others not to obsess about things that don't belong to them, even if just in their thoughts? Ultimately, the last ones here can be summed up really simply. It's just don't steal. Don't steal my life. Don't steal my wife. Don't steal my things. Don't steal my reputation. And while you're in my house, can you just not even think about stealing stuff? Right? Does that sound reasonable? And I think everyone would agree. These are the foundation to just a good society. These are not some sort of oppressive rules from an oppressive God. These are a moral law that exists forever because it's ultimately centered around love. We see that the first 2 can be summed up for love. The first 4 can be summed up for love for God. And the last 6 can be summed up for love of man. The order of that is very important. Ultimately, to come together, we see that together it's just all about love, and God's law is love. We find the formula that God used to allow us to have free will is wrapped up in his law. And we don't obey his law out of fear or out of anything other than love. If you love me, he says, keep my commandments. Especially request number 4. It's interesting that he says that, God wants to spend time with us. Remember the 7th day to keep it holy. And he actually used the word remember. It's actually the only commandment which starts with the word remember. There's not one that says remember not to kill. It only says remember the Sabbath day. Because he knew that would be the one that people would, and many say, well, these commands are no longer valid. And there's actually a whole course I just did on is the 7th day Sabbath still valid? I recommend watching that video. But if we were to go briefly through the New Testament, after people will say, well, in the New Testament, none of these, Christ did away with all of these. But if we look at the first commandment, there's plenty of evidence of, there being one God. There's plenty of evidence of staying away from idolatry. Plenty of evidence of keeping God's name holy and not blaspheming. Plenty of evidence of the disciples keeping the 7th day Sabbath. Plenty of evidence of obeying the parents, not killing, right? We see plenty about not having adultery, about not stealing. about not lying about other people's reputations, and about not having covetousness. So ultimately, when we get through this, there really is no excuse anymore. The moral law is very clear. It's eternal. It's used in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and it's just a logical foundation for a society, all rooted in love.